The Witcher. Such an amazing series with a vast, detailed world, interesting characters, and stories to discover. Now when I mention The Witcher, images of The Witcher 3 is probably what comes to mind for the majority of you, and for good reason. It is a wonderfully crafted game. You might even think it is the best Witcher game of the trilogy, but I argue that the best Witcher game of them all is, without a doubt, the first Witcher game. Okay, maybe not. The first Witcher game was decent back when it released in 2007, although for today, well, it hasn't aged too well. Despite this, if you're more interested in the story and lore of the various characters rather than the actual gameplay, then I would still recommend giving it a shot, which is what I did. And as I was playing, I thought to myself, man, wouldn't it be awesome to see what The Witcher 1 would have looked like if it was made today? And then I realized, hey, wait a second, I could do that, so why don't I? The idea came about quickly, and my eagerness to start working was no exception. Immediately I began writing down what I would need to do in order to complete such an ambitious project, with the first step being crucial.
Well that should be easy.
With that out of the way, I was now in the right mindset to properly start. The second step was to pick a location to recreate from The Witcher 1. Now The Witcher contains many unique locations, but there was one place in particular that I felt would work best. That being the slums in the Temple Quarters. Okay, maybe not the most interesting place, but hear me out. My reasoning for this was that it was a well-defined area, and furthermore, being slightly lower than the rest of the city meant that there were minimal distant details which would aid the project, as I would not have to waste time fleshing out the background. And also, the player comes down here often for various quests, so it should resonate with players in comparison to picking some random spot like in the swamp. Alright, now that I know what I'm recreating, it's time to, start recreating. What I decided to do first was to record some clips of me walking around this area in-game, to use as reference material. With this material, I started modelling the various houses. For the 3D modelling, I decided to use Blender, as it is free, open source, and more importantly, with its 2.8 update, it was now really user-friendly, which was the only thing holding me back from using it before. Now, for creating the houses, I didn't measure any distances, or really plan it out at all. I simply eyeballed the whole process and just tried to keep within a similar layout. By doing this, I could give it my own style whilst also helping with time, as this project would take months and months if I tried to get everything perfect. So, as you watch me create these models, let me educate you on the basics of 3D modeling in the aspect of games. To start off, what I'm doing is called traditional primitive 3D modeling, which is where you create your 3D models by manipulating primitive shapes such as cubes and cylinders. The key elements are vertices, edges, and faces. Each one of these components can be selected and manipulated in some way, i.e. change position, extruding new geometry out, and so forth. That's really all you need to know to start 3D modeling. Of course there's much more to discover, but you'll slowly learn this as you go. An important thing to remember when designing 3D models for games is that they need to be performant. This essentially means to reduce complexity of the model where possible. For example, removing the faces from underneath a building model, since the player should never be able to see that underside. Small things like this add up and allow a game to run smoother. There are also a bunch more ways to improve a model's performance, like LODs, level of detail, but we'll get to them later. The building is looking good, however the world of The Witcher isn't in grayscale. We need to add some colour and texture to this house. The way we do this is through a process called UV mapping, which involves projecting a 2D image onto a 3D surface. I find that the best way to understand this is the example of a cube. We can easily unwrap the cube into this simple flat arrangement that we can then draw on top of and then project back to see our drawings on the 3D model. Doing this with our houses, we get this. It's definitely looking better, but it's a bit flat. So could we make it look better? You may initially think to just add more geometry to the mesh. For example, where we place the brick texture, we could extrude out individual bricks. This would definitely improve the quality, but it will also make the mesh very complex, and as I mentioned earlier, we need to consider performance for games. Luckily for us, some smart people have already figured this out, and is to use additional maps beyond the base texture, like a normal map, which describes how light should bounce off the surface. Our game engine can take this information and apply it to a surface to create the illusion of this additional geometry. Now there are more maps that we could add, like occlusion maps, metallic maps, height maps, and so on. These all add more detail, so I'll be adding them in, but I'm not going to explain each one since, well, we're here to recreate The Witcher 1 and not to have a lecture about material rendering. So with these extra maps, the building is finally looking ready to use. Let's just do this process with a few more houses. Nice! The next step is to start constructing the environment, which is by far the funnest part of the project. I'm using the Unity game engine to do this. Unity has different pipelines that you can use depending on the types of visuals you would like to achieve. At first I went with standard Unity, as it is what I knew best, but I soon found out that I wouldn't be able to achieve the level of realism that I was aiming for. The main reason being that there was no way to easily create decals, which are projections of an image onto surfaces. The bullet hole marks in games are an example of a decal. These decals are a great way to add extra detail such as mud splatters, which is needed to achieve that realistic quality. So before long I swapped over to Unity's HDRP, or High Dynamic Render Pipeline, a pipeline designed for the highest quality of graphics. I had a little experience with this pipeline, but after messing around a bit and a few tutorials later, I learnt enough to start constructing the environment once again. You may notice that the lighting setup has changed from the original scene. I did this as I found that with the current lighting, the detail of the houses was best shown off. On the topic of lighting, an aspect that is important to consider is reflections. Reflections enable the differing colours of materials to be bounced around to other models, allowing everything to blend together and look uniform. Furthermore, if the material is especially reflective, we can see a full reflection of other models, which always looks great. I use this with my puddles to really give the illusion of a muddy surface. The two components I used to handle reflections were reflection probes, which cast reflections from a static point, and screen space reflections, which calculate reflections using data from the player's view, meaning that the reflections are accurate. I won't be going too in depth with this stuff, but be aware that I will be releasing a second video that is purely for you guys that want to know all the technical details. Alright, back on topic. The houses are looking great and all, but I find that the key to making an interesting and realistic level is in the small details. So let's create a few prop objects like planks, cauldrons, carts, and many more. Awesome. In combination with some of the foliage models from Nature Manufacture's Meadow Environment asset pack, we can start adding these small details in. When placing these details, you have to consider realism. For instance, I'm not placing much vegetation directly in the middle of the pathways. Why? Well, because I imagine that these paths are being walked on non-stop, and vegetation that did grow would quickly be flattened. This also makes sense with why the ground is so muddy. I occasionally use the planks for makeshift walkways so that the citizens wouldn't always have to walk through the mud. These are just some examples of how I consider the placement of my props. Of course, I don't have this high of a level of consideration for every prop I place, but it's a good thing to have in the back of your mind. The scene is really starting to come to life. Everything seems to be going great, but as all good stories go, there is always a climax, and I was just about to hit it. When trying to open the project, I got hit with one of these. Oof. Not to worry though, I always back up my project, which I recommend you always do since you never know when this stuff will happen. Wait, what? Yo, future self, remember to back up the project, yeah? Cheers. Oh my god. Alright, so yeah, I forgot to back up. And what made it worse is this seemed to be a type of crash that I had never dealt with before. But luckily, after a few painful hours of reading crash logs and googling, I finally got the project to open again. Yet, it was kinda broken. So some more fixing later, I finally got everything back to normal. Now you would think at this point I would have done an actual backup, but no. I thought that I knew what caused the crash and that it would never happen again. Well, Actually, you know what? I won't tell you. We'll just see what happens later on. So I just continued making the scene, repeating the same process you have already seen, recording some clips in game, using those clips as reference to create 3D models, and then finally arranging the created models in Unity, building up the detail from just the buildings to the decals, props, and finally vegetation. So I'll shut up for now, and you can watch sections of the environment slowly develop. Then we can come back and move our attention towards other aspects such as player movement and sound design. The scene is looking awesome, although this whole time I've been viewing it using a flying camera, which is great for a quick overview of the scene, but well, it's not too immersive, so let's add a first person controller.
But the Witcher series is in third person, not first.
Alright. Yes, I know. And I did actually try a third person controller at first. The only thing is though, I can't really model realistic characters, so you just end up with this abomination.
Look at the top of his head!
So yeah, we're keeping with the first person controller. Luckily, I had created a first person controller in another one of my projects, so all I had to do was import it into the scene and bam! I could now walk around in game. Seeing the scene in this perspective actually helped a lot more than I thought, as I finally got a good sense of scale, and furthermore, it allowed me to notice areas that needed a bit more detail. Now I just had to add colliders to the various models so you wouldn't be playing as a ghost. Yet again a simple task, and before long I could jump around on the rooftops. Now it was time for sound design. Now unfortunately I feel like sound design doesn't get the recognition it deserves when it comes to game development videos. Sound design is crucial, and if you don't believe me, just play any game without the effects audio. It just ain't right. If you really want to immerse your players in your game, you need audio clips for ambient aspects, this being the world itself, so if you have a fire, you expect to hear the crackling of the wood. These types of effects ground the believability of your objects in the scene. For the scene, everything is static, so a generic ambient sound clip will suffice. The next aspect is audio clips for player interactivity. This could be picking up objects, or for our case, player movement. Audio clips that trigger when the player is interacting with the controller also helps verify that something has happened. To trigger audio clips when the player walks is actually quite simple. I just trigger a loop that plays a random audio clip at a set interval, depending if the player is moving or not. The hard part is playing the right audio clip depending on the surface the player is on. We don't want a wood sound to play when the player is walking on a stone surface. Usually you can easily achieve this by tagging the colliders of objects with a specific tag, i.e. set the wooden containers to be a tag of wood. Then we can check for the current tag the player is colliding with and play the correct audio. The only issue arises when we want the terrain itself to play different audio, as the terrain is a single object with different textures, so we can't just tag it with a single material. I had never dealt with this issue before, as the last time I implemented a footstep system I did not use the Unity terrain system. But I managed to find an amazing blog post going over how to retrieve a percentage of which textures the player is currently standing on by transferring the player coordinates to coordinates of the terrain splat map. I will of course include a link to this blog in the description. So after a bit of coding and making sure it implemented well with my character controller code, I soon had this. Nice. Now I just need some sound effects. For these I went with freesound.org and searched around for some clips. Then I split them up in Audacity and implemented them into the footstep system. And finally, the audio for the scene was complete. It really does help make the world feel a lot more believable. And with that, the actual scene is essentially done. I'm just going to tidy it up a little bit more, and then I think it's time for a small cinematic. Oh, also, this was the time that second crash occurred. Yeah, that kinda sucked. But back to the cinematic. If you want to explore this scene yourself, you can download it from Itch.io, link in the description below. Let me know if you want to see any other areas from The Witcher to be recreated, or if you want to see me recreate the visuals of an entirely different game. I would love to do another project like this in the future. Hope you enjoyed the video. I recommend you give it a like, subscribe, and a share. Let's see if that works. Anyway guys, that's all for now. Hope you, your friends and family are staying safe and healthy. Alright, that's all. See you in the next one.